The Babadook is an Australian psychological horror film written and directed by Jennifer Kent in her directorial debut. The film itself, while being a traditional horror film, also has a deeper, more meaningful message, as it explores the ways in which human beings deal with the emotions of both grief and loss. Kent's excellent writing and directing creates a film that doesn't just tell a twisted story about a demonic entity, but creates a narrative that follows the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. The house they live in also complements the family's sense of grief and loss. The walls appear grey and stolen of all life, exemplifying the sense of decay that coexists not just with the house, but the family too, perpetuating the family's grievances as they are surrounded by the very pain that plagues their minds. As it is said that, characterization is born in these types of films out of deliberately pathological rather than social or psychological kinds of stereotypes. When we are first introduced to the children's book Mr. Babadook, Amelia is quick to hide it as it illustrates a series of disturbing images and chilling narrations, while Samuel insists that the Babadook actually exists. Amelia attempts to convince her son that the entity is simply a figment of his imagination, even going as far as to tear up the book and dispose of it in the trash. This act of the film ultimately demonstrates the first stage of grief, denial, as Amelia is simply unwilling to accept the existence of the entity. This idea can be reflected in the loss of her husband in this scene.
There's a big difference.
God, Amelia, as soon as anyone mentions Oscar, you can't cope.
That's not true.
It'll be 7 years. Isn't it time you moved on?
I have moved on. I don't mention him. I don't talk about him. What strain is that on you, Claire?
The scene demonstrates how she interprets her own sense of grief, denying the fact that someone even mentioning his name has a drastic effect on her, exemplifying that although she may have buried her past, she has never truly faced it and come to terms with the loss of her husband, just like the Babadook. Over the course of the film, we see Amelia transcend into the second stage of grief, anger, as she is plagued by the relentless onslaught of her disobedient child and her initial interactions with the infamous Babadook. Amelia can be seen criticising her friends for having the perfect lives, while hers is sanctioned to one of pain and misery. This sense of anger that begins to engulf Amelia's life is ultimately directed at her son, as seen here.
Mommy! She wouldn't believe me! Mommy!
Just be normal!
Lashing out at the only individual who is trying to protect her from the Babadook and assist her through her feelings of grief. Amelia's interactions with the Babadook begin small, with bumps in the night before manifesting into ominous phone calls and finally sightings, all increasing Amelia's aggressive nature towards her son.
I'm really hungry, Mum.
Why do you have to keep talking? Don't you ever stop?
I was just...
I need to sleep.
I'm sorry, Mummy. I was just really hungry.
If you're that hungry, why don't you go and eat shit?
This gradual increase in anger finally reaches a boiling point. Amelia finally snaps and acts out aggressively towards her son, all the while Samuel just wants to protect her in a truly unsettling and frightening scene.
Is this what I have to do?
I'm sorry, Mummy. It's just that the Babadook made you crash the car
What
and
did you
then... I said the Babadook...
The Babadook isn't real, Samuel. It's just something you've made up in your stupid little head.
I just didn't want you to let it in.
I'll make sure nothing gets in tonight. All right, Samuel?
In creating this scene's sense of unease, it is said that the Gothic representation of mental disturbance and the narration and evocation of immoderate emotional reactions are mirrored in horror films' frequent resort to expressionistic mise-en-scene and its goal of inspiring terror. The final act of the film follows Amelia as she is overcome by the Babadook, manipulated and or possessed into actively attempting to kill her son in hopes that the Babadook will reunite her with her husband, or what is the third stage of grief, bargaining. Throughout this act, Amelia is not only mentally drawn to this unreasonable sense of bargaining, but her physical interactions and appearance also display this sense of disconnect as well. Amelia's hair appears messy and unordered, her mannerisms become creepy and frightening, while her actions become unrecognisable as she is seen ripping out a loose tooth and breaking the neck of the family dog. Furthermore, descending deeper into a state of mind that contradicts her own beliefs. The film continues to follow Amelia as she actively seeks out her own son Samuel, enveloped in the idea that she wished it was he who died in the car accident, not her husband, playing with this sense of bargaining and trading one life for another. Ultimately, Samuel's perseverance in not giving up on his mother dispels the Babadook from Amelia, ridding her of the Babadook's malicious goals and the personification of the sense of bargaining altogether. Amelia's final confrontation with the Babadook ultimately symbolises the fourth stage of grief, depression. Amelia is confronted with her husband and is forced to relive his death again. She is brought to tears as a combination of blood, tears and black tar visibly demonstrate her path throughout each of the stages of grief, and a final deliverance to depression. Although Amelia is clearly impacted by the death of her husband, she and her son manage to find the strength to overcome the Babadook as a family, casting the entity to the isolation and emptiness of the basement. Although not totally gone, both Samuel and Amelia defeat the Babadook and ultimately the pain and grief that has lived with them for so many years. Finally, at the conclusion of the film, Amelia and Samuel find themselves at the final stage of grief, acceptance. As the colour palette of the film becomes much brighter and warmer, the physical attributes of the characters appear cleaner, and the mental state of the family appears stable and resolved. Although it was demonstrated that the Babadook still lingers within the basement of the house, as we can see Amelia feeding it worms, it is ultimately an analogy for how, although we cannot completely rid ourselves of the feeling of grief, we can learn to accept it and make it a part of our lives, even if that sense of grief can hurt more from time to time, as depicted in the final scene of the film.
How was it?
It's pretty quiet today. Me.
It's getting much better, Mum.
To be human means coming to know loss as part of your life, as while grief is a powerful experience, so too is the ability to help in your own healing, reinvest in life, while never forget the one that you loved. Overall, The Babadook isn't your typical horror film. It has a message, one of grief, demonstrating how to overcome it, how to understand it, and how to ultimately accept it. The Babadook itself isn't your typical movie monster. It's the personification of grief, and acts as the visual representation of how we as human beings interpret grief and manage it, letting us live the best lives we can. After all, no matter how hard you try, you can't get rid of the Babadook.